Hi, I'm Jason Sulliman. At the start of the semester, I thought it would be helpful to make a video on time management. A lot of us are embarking upon a pretty busy time in our lives. It's a good time to think about how we can maybe better manage our time. So please feel free to share this video among students and colleagues. And for those of you that know me, you know that I teach music and I tend to focus my efforts on application toward music, but I think this one's a little bit more broadly consumable. So please feel free to share with anyone you think that might benefit. Some things to consider when thinking about time and how to manage or spend your time. We all have the same amount of time. There's 24 hours in a day, there's 168 hours in a week, and we're all dealing with that same kind of constraint. We all have basic needs. We have to eat, we have to sleep, we have to go to work or go to school, we spend time with other people, and to some extent, that is necessary. And these things take time, and everything has a cost to it, if you will, of that resource of time. So here are a few ways to look at how we spend it. Abraham Lincoln once said that if you give me 6 hours to chop down a tree, I'll spend the first four sharpening the axe. And I thought that that was a really poignant way of saying plan and prepare how you're going to spend your time. The current, analogy might be the more that you actually prepare and think about and make plans for how you're going to spend your time and budget your time, the more wisely you're going to spend it. This story is a pretty common story, so some of you have heard it before. Feel free to fast forward for a minute or two if you already know the punchline. But imagine that I had a jar, and imagine I filled that jar with rocks, and then I asked, "Is the jar full?" Many people would probably say, "Yeah, the jar is full." But then if I pulled out maybe a bucket of tiny pebbles, and I pour the tiny pebbles over the rocks, and it falls in, they spill into the little cracks and crevices, and then it eventually slowly fills up the jar. Then I ask again, "Is the jar full?" And some people might say, okay, yeah, now the jar's full. And then I get a bucket of sand and I pull that out and I start pouring sand into the jar and it fills up around the pebbles and the rocks and fills in all the crevices and the cracks. And then I ask again, is the jar full? Maybe some people say yes, but aha, I could pull out a bottle of water or a bucket of water and pour water into the jar and then water would fill around and kind of find that negative space and fill it up. And for people who don't know the story, one might assume that the moral of it is, even when you think you're full, even when you think you're using all your time and you couldn't possibly do any more, that you can always add a little bit more. You can always do a little more. That's actually not the takeaway at all. The takeaway is this. You have to make sure that the big rocks go in the bucket first. The big rocks represent, of course, the things that are the most important to us. So here's two pictures. The one on the top, if you start with sand, if you start with the water and the sand, and then you work your way backwards through the little pebbles, there's going to be no room for the big rocks left at the end. And sometimes we all feel this kind of, we get pulled in so many different directions and we get wrapped up in all these things that aren't really the most important things to us. Then we don't have enough resource left for the big rocks to go into the jar. The bottom picture is more representative of maybe a more desirable course of action. Make sure the big rocks go in the bucket first. What do you spend your time on? Well, a number of years ago, there was a book called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, written by Stephen Covey, and it kind of, blew through corporate America, and everybody loved it. And one of the concepts in the book was kind of categorizing things into a couple of different categories. So here we have urgent and not urgent, and we have important and unimportant, and that kind of creates a four, quadrant grid here. And it makes sense that things that are urgent and important would be, of course, the priority to do the soonest, like right now. And then things that are not urgent and not important can probably wait a little bit. So those would probably fall toward the end of the list. And then in the middle, we've got these, kind of hybrid categories of, well, it's urgent, but it's not important, or it's important, but it's not urgent. And that kind of falls in that second category. And some people kind of interpret the takeaway as something like this. But there was a man named Randy Pausch who taught at Carnegie Mellon University, worked on virtual reality, was an incredible researcher, did a lot of work, I think, even with Disney, some of their imagination stuff. And, tenured faculty member, family, job, life's going well, everything's great. One day finds out from his doctor that he has a rare form of pancreatic cancer, has 3 months to live, something like that. It's a bad hand to be dealt, but what he did was he came up with the last lecture. And so he created this presentation to talk about, those parting words of, how to spend your time and how to best use your time, because time is all that you have left. It eventually turned into a book, but it's also this video on YouTube. You can actually go and watch the last lecture. If you haven't seen it, I highly, highly, highly recommend that you do. Take the time and go Google search that and watch that. But one of the concepts that Randy Pausch talked about in that lecture was he said, look, if it's not important, don't worry about it. Don't do it. It's not important. If it's important to you, and it may be important due to ancillary reasons, but if it's important to you, okay, fine. That means that it's in the important category. And then from there, you have some things that are urgent and some things that are not urgent. So obviously you have to kind of go toward the urgent things first, and then we all hope that we get an opportunity to get to the important things that are maybe not as urgent. But the easiest way to do that is to make sure that you're not worrying about the stuff that is not important. So I felt like that was a really clarifying way to kind of talk about that concept. Another way to think about it, anytime we're talking about resource, whether it's in the form of a finished product or we're talking about time that we're spending or thought that we're spending, there's a couple of qualities to that resource. It can be good, it can be fast, and it can be cheap. In fact, it can even be a couple of these. It can be good and cheap. It can be cheap and fast. It can be fast and good, but it's never going to be all three. All three doesn't exist. That's a unicorn. That's that magic middle section of that Venn diagram. It doesn't exist. And if it does, it's probably illegal, right? If you think about anything, I go to McDonald's and I buy a cheeseburger for $1 and I get it in less than a minute. It was fast and it was cheap. It's probably not the best food out there. Anything that you're doing, you can probably figure out kind of what qualities go into that, whether we're talking about time and effort that you're putting forth to something, or time and effort or products that are coming back your way. Maybe you're receiving them in some way. Most of the time, you're going to have to make decisions about how you want to spend your time, even from a qualitative standpoint. So sometimes you're going to say, look, I've got to do this work and I've got to do it good and cheap. Cheap could be cost of resource. How much energy does it take? How much time does it take from you? That could be a form of cheap as well. So it's got to be good and cheap. It's probably not going to be fast. Or it's good and fast. It's probably not going to be cheap. That's probably going to be costly for you. But if you think about things along this line, that might help clarify the way that you plan on spending your time. Neil Gaiman had a really great way of kind of referring to this as well. He gave a commencement speech for the University of the Arts in 2012. And he talked about his work. He's a writer. For those of you who are into comic books, you may have already heard of him. But he talked about turning your work in on time, always being a delight to work with, and producing really good work. And he kind of joked about how you don't even need to have all three of those. 2 out of 3, you'll be fine for most of the time. You can turn your work in on time, always be a delight to work with, and maybe sometimes the quality isn't as high. Or I'm sure we all know people that do great work and it's always on time. We just don't like them very much. They're not very pleasant to be around, right? But they do good work and it's fast, and so they are going to get hired. In any context or domain, you're going to find work and resources and people that fit kind of these categories. So you have to figure out kind of where you want to be within that. And that may change depending on the task, depending on the day. But if you make those decisions, then you're going to be that much more likely to be using time effectively. So let's take a look at some of the human differences in how we spend time. I was very fortunate that I got an opportunity to study heuristics. Sorry, I went a little too fast there. Heuristics is one of the studies that essentially looks at the explore versus exploit paradigm. And the common ways that it has been studied is animals foraging for food, speed dating, and games of chance. I'm going to go a little bit into the animals foraging for food. It relates to all sorts of human behavior. So food foraging, here's an example of how it would be observed and studied. So let's say you got 2 shrubs and there are berries on these shrubs, and those berries are a form of resource for animals like birds, right? A bird flies up and looks at the 2 shrubs and has to make a decision about which shrub it's going to fly up to and start consuming the berries. So it makes the decision, it flies up to the shrub, and it starts consuming the resource. It starts consuming the berries on the shrub. At some point, the bird's going to say, hey, wait a second. There is a greater concentration of resource on that other shrub over there. So I am going to fly over there and I'm going to start consuming that resource. That's a better use of my time, right? Well, the real interesting question is, at what point does that phase shift occur for the bird? And as it turns out, it depends on the bird. And if you look at human behavior, it depends on the person as well. There's a wide range of individual differences that occur. We tend to look at this more along the terms of ADD and OCD, and I put quotes around those because it's not exactly defining those here, but you can imagine that if you are more in the exploratory side of things in terms of resource, that's much more of an ADD thing, and exploits more of an OCD thing. ADD might be difficulty staying on task, glossing over details, maybe getting bored with things a little more quickly, wanting to jump ship, move on to other things, switch gears, etc. OCD might be staying too long on a specific task, maybe rarely getting past the first few etudes in a book. For those of you musicians that are practicing, you know what I'm talking about. Maybe it comes with the difficulty of sight reading because you're not actually reading a lot of novel repertoire. Those are just some garden variety examples of the way this may apply. And most people can identify with being somewhere skewed either to the left or the right of this spectrum. For musical context, some examples of explore versus exploit. Sight reading tends to be more exploratory because you're exploring and exploring and exploring more repertoire. You're not really cleaning it and getting really good at it. You're just reading it, right? So you're seeing a lot of things and it's going by pretty quickly. You're focused on breadth more than depth, right? Jazz bands tend to function this way. It's more of an exploratory ensemble because the goal of most jazz bands is to do more reading than perhaps marching bands or drum corps, as an example. They tend to take a smaller amount of repertoire and spend a much greater amount of time refining the details in that small amount of repertoire, right? If you play the same warm-up every day as opposed to different warm-ups every day, that'd be more exploitive as opposed to explorational. It applies to life. This goes well beyond music, but these are just some examples. So one of the things that you can do if you want to be better at managing your time is you got to figure out where you kind of default on this spectrum, and then you got to try to find a healthy balance. And that usually means kind of working your way toward the middle, but cultivating some skills and chops and effectiveness on the other side. So if you're more of an exploit individual, you want to try to cultivate the ability to be a little bit more, exploratory. If you're more of an explore type bird, you want to try to get a little bit more exploit abilities as you kind of hone your skills in terms of how you do your work. You want to work your way to the middle. Some of the most effective teachers I've ever seen are people that have the ability to essentially steer the boat of the class or of the ensemble. If we're talking about a musical director of some kind or conductor, they can make shifts to how they're doing things based upon what the needs of the ensemble are, and they do it highly effectively, but they can take advantage of whatever the needs are in that moment and go with that. And they have kind of control and autonomy over that, as opposed to some who just happen to default into whatever their personality, is more geared for. I've had conductors kind of in all three. I've had conductors that are more, ADD-ish in the way that they deliver, and their rehearsals run that way. I've had some that are more OCD, and we spent, hours on the first three measures, and we never, we get to the dress rehearsal, we haven't read, we haven't played all the music yet. And then I've worked with some highly effective conductors that really were in the middle, that seemed to be able to kind of toggle back and forth as needed. So write down how you think you spend your time. Now, you're going to be spending time going to class, you're going to be spending time doing homework, practicing, social. You're going to be maintaining social relationships, you're going to be spending time, personal time. That might be brushing your teeth, eating a meal, going to the bathroom, I don't know, whatever. Write it down. Write down how you think you spend your time. Then measure how you actually spend your time. Take a couple days and write everything down. How much time did you spend on this? How much time did you spend on that? And figure out what it was. It sounds time consuming, but remember, sharpening the axe here. Now, the third thing is you want to figure out how you should spend your time. And that's going to come down to decisions that you're going to make based on what's important to you, the big rocks in the bucket, right? Plan it out and go. The goal is to have all three of those converge into like a very similar plan. Like what you actually think you're doing and what you're actually doing, similar, if not the same, right? What you should be doing versus what you're actually doing, the same. That's the goal. We want those all to be the same. So here are some personal hacks. For those of you that know me, I spent a lot of time in college, and it definitely wasn't all keg parties. I spent 16 years working on several advanced degrees. I learned a lot of stuff, and frankly, I'm addicted to learning. I still learn every day. I read books constantly. I'm even taking some online classes. I'm never going to give up on trying to learn new things. Some of the things I've learned along the way is how to manage the busy schedules. So here are some personal pieces of advice that I can share with you. Number one, get up early and do your most important work first. There was a researcher named Anders Ericsson, who unfortunately passed away recently, who gave us the concept of deliberate practice and is known to have coined the phrase the 10,000 hour rule. Wrote a seminal paper called The Role of Deliberate Practice in the Acquisition of Expert Performance. There's some other papers obviously as well. And for those of you who are not as inclined to read, the academic journals and the academic articles, there's a book called Outliers written by Malcolm Gladwell. It's much more Main Street consumable, but it talks about this concept of the 10,000 hour rule toward mastering a skill of some kind. And Anders Ericsson kind of brought this idea to us. And basically the research suggests that human beings have about 4 hours of resource that can be put toward high level focus, high level thought, deliberate practice, the really draining work, nitty gritty, going after our biggest weaknesses, highly planned, highly focused. We have about 4 hours of availability per day. That's going to get spent in all sorts of little directions, a minute here, 4 minutes there, half hour there. And by the end of the day, after you've spent about that 4 hours, that's pretty much all you got. So if you can get up early, and then when you are most refreshed and rested, put forth that deliberate practice, that deliberate effort toward the things that are the most important to you, do it first. Because I've lived both sides of the coin. I used to work the night shift during grad school at one point. I was practicing, at the middle of the night. I used to practice late at night. I've practiced early in the morning, and hands down, practicing early in the morning, it's far more productive for me. I'm more awake. I'm using a more higher quality resource. I have more of that deliberate energy kind of available to me. Because if you go all day long and you're doing all sorts of things, you get to like 10 o'clock at night, and then you're going to go sit down and produce your best work. It's probably not going to happen. You're probably going to be a little bit drained. So if you can get up early, do it early. And mind you, I'm not a morning person. I'm not saying I enjoy getting up early. I just enjoy getting better at the trombone, and I enjoy that more than sleeping in. So there you have it. You can use timers to stay on track. So there's an app called Seconds Pro. It's a pretty cool app. You can put in all sorts of different things that you want to do. You can allocate a certain amount of time to do it, and it basically just makes a really nice big stopwatch that counts down. And then when the timer's up, you go to the next thing, you push go, you do your thing. I'm a little more old school, and I just use a stopwatch on my phone so I can keep track of how much time I'm playing my lip slurs or my long tones or my, whatever I happen to be playing. One of the great things about it is that it can help you kind of find your way to the middle of that explore versus exploit paradigm. Let's say you're more of an ADD kind of studier or practicer. You read a page, you get bored, you want to do something else, or you're practicing, you get bored, you want to do something else. If you set a timer and you work up a goal to stay on something for 3 minutes or 5 minutes or 10 minutes or whatever, and you kind of work up your chops towards staying focused on one thing, you're essentially pulling yourself to the middle of that spectrum. If you're somebody who can get just lost in a rabbit hole, and then you stick your head up out of the sand like 45 minutes later, and you're like, oh, where did the time go? A timer can keep you on track. When the timer goes off, you go to the next thing, so you don't get bogged down with a small number of things, and you get a little bit more breadth in what you're trying to do in terms of workload. So it can kind of pull everybody to the middle, regardless of what side you're on. So it's kind of a nice ubiquitous tool that can help in time management. Make time for evaluation. It's one thing to plan, and it's another thing to do it, but then you have to observe and analyze and correct and make sure that the way that you planned is actually the most effective thing. There's kind of a Goldilocks zone. For those of you that have read Goldilocks and the Three Bears, you're just getting trained for high-level time management. You always want to ask yourself the question, did I spend enough time on that to make a meaningful amount of progress today? And that answer is going to vary on the task, and it's going to vary on the day. But you either spent too much or not enough, or maybe you found that Goldilocks zone in the middle. But it's okay to constantly evaluate and make sure you're finding that Goldilocks zone. We want to thread the needle in terms of how much time and effort we're allocating towards things. Number 4, maintain control of your time. Now, this one's geared more towards the college students here, but most music schools come with a lounge. And I don't know about you, but when I was in music school, there were always a couple people that I could pretty much bet money were going to be sitting in that lounge no matter what time of day I walked by it. It's a time suck, and they had the best of intentions, but often they would sit there, and obviously, more likely they are the social creatures that like that interaction with other people. But people just keep showing up to the lounge. It's like a revolving door. And so you could just sit there and find yourself engaging in more and more social, energy and consumption. You're not getting the practicing done, right? And so if you want to be practicing, that's not really a great place to be for that. What I would try to do is if I went to the lounge, I would not sit down. I would remain standing. I would pop in. I would say hi to people. Hey, how's everybody doing? Good. Great. And then I would be there for a minute or two. But since I wasn't sitting, I wouldn't get comfortable. I would say, all right, I'm going to go back to practicing. I'll see you all later. For those of you that it's the same thing as like being the last to leave a party or to close the bar down or something like that. You don't have to close the place down. I'm not saying don't go to the party. I'm saying don't close the place down. Go, Say hi to people, be social, whatever you need. But if you really want to spend time practicing getting better, and let's say you're going to get up early and do it in the morning, you got to get some sleep. So you're going to have to leave a little earlier than the last person. If you get a ride from somebody to said party, and they're the kind of person that wants to close down the party, you may be at the mercy of their schedule. You have lost control of your time. So as much as you can, try to maintain control of your time. Now, I know right now we're dealing with the COVID pandemic, so nobody should be hanging out with anybody right now, really. But at some point, that's going to change, and we're going to start seeing more social interaction, and it's going to be much more comfortable as opposed to calculated. But one of the silver linings might be that right now, some of us are maybe calculating our social engagement a little bit more, and that is directly in line with time management. So just kind of maybe keep that in mind. Number 5, be an efficient sleeper. If you want to be one of the most productive people, you have to be one of the most productive sleepers so that you're resting and recuperating your body so that you are prepared for that high level work. So let's talk about sleep a little bit, because a lot of people are not good at sleeping right now. A lot of my students are, really struggling with the sleep thing. So there's a number of different ways that you can divvy up your sleep in terms of the evening. And there's a couple things that we human beings have kind of fallen into. So it's referred to phases or, phasic. Monophasic refers to one, you go to sleep, you do all your sleeping, you wake up, then you're awake until you go to sleep again, right? Biphasic refers to you sleep at essentially 2 different points in the day. For most people that are biphasic, this is going to be you do most of your sleeping at night, and then maybe you take a nap in the afternoon at some point, a little siesta in the middle of the day, right? But there's also a couple of other versions, Everyman, Uberman, and as you can see, the sleep gets a little more distributed evenly as you go. Nikola Tesla and Leonardo da Vinci were known to be more of the Uberman sleep schedule people. Da Vinci was reported to sleep about 20 minutes every 4 hours. Tesla kind of had a similar thing. It's actually not very good for you. That's what the research says. And there's some speculation that it was more about the fact that they were maybe dealing with some kind of mania or insomnia that led them to have that kind of sleep schedule. It's not really the healthiest for the human body. Most, like a vast majority of people are monophasic and biphasic sleepers. There is some research that suggests that if you can take a nap anywhere from 20 to 40 minutes, maybe mid-afternoon, something like that, you'll actually be more productive throughout the course of your day. And some of that studies involves conservatory, I think, in Hamburg with piano students. So there are some musical contexts that were directly studied with that. But 95% of the people function best with either monophasic or biphasic sleep schedules. So maybe one nap, but let's not do any kind of Da Vinci 20 minutes every 4 hours type thing. Adding a nap, yeah, it has been shown to boost creativity, productivity, etc. And less than 5% of the people, that have been studied can get by on less than 6 hours of sleep. Most people are probably in the 7 to 9 hour region, although most of us are horribly deprived. We may not be able to make a lot of change to that, but if we're sleeping as effectively as possible, maybe you only lie down for 6 hours, but getting 6 hours of sleep during that 6 hours is far more productive than lying down, going to bed, and only getting about 3 or 4 hours during that 6 hours. Far less productive for our bodies. Another thing to consider is that when we sleep, it's not exactly even cycles, and the longer that you sleep, the more you get into some of these rapid eye movement kind of zones. And that's one of the reasons why you don't want to distribute your sleeping into a bunch of even chunks of the day, because you never get to those huge, REM, rapid eye movement, sessions, because you never sleep long enough to kind of get into those deeper zones. So it's just something to consider, if you can get a big chunk of sleep, obviously at night. So here are a few ways to try to get better sleep. Number 1, limit device time, smartphone usage, computer usage, etc. 30 minutes before bed. Start making a habit of pulling yourself away from the technology roughly 30 minutes before you go to bed. And you might have to start with 5 minutes, but then work up to 10, 15, 20. Try to get 30 minutes before you go to bed. Because if you think you're going to be scrolling through your Instagram feed 5 minutes, while you're lying in bed, and then you're going to turn your phone off and put it over there, and you're going to magically fall right asleep, it's not going to happen. Your brain is stimulated in a way it's going to be very difficult for you to fall asleep. You can substitute that time with personal wellness, stretching, yoga, meditation. These are all wonderful things to calm the body down and get you into a better place to find that productive sleep. Avoid late calorie consumption. Now, sometimes we've got late rehearsals and we've got gigs, and then we got to go to Sonic afterwards and just grab a burger on the way home. But if we consume a lot of food and a lot of calories late at night, especially if it's processed food, fast food, high in calories, saturated fats, cholesterol, sugars, all that kind of stuff, it's going to be hard to fall asleep. Your body's going to be busy metabolizing that food that you just consumed, and you're going to be up for a little bit. And if you try to go to sleep, you're either going to have trouble going to sleep or it's not going to be as restful. So, intermittent fasting kind of makes its rounds. I'm actually, somebody who's intermittent fasting right now. I don't eat after 8 p.m. And it's really been a game changer. Before, I used to just eat whenever. I didn't really pay attention to it, and now I'm much more cautious and careful about that. Of course, I'm in the over 40 club, so my nutritional choices have definitely changed over the years. If you can get a consistent sleep schedule every day, that's another big thing. And in college, sometimes your schedule is not set up that way. Here's an example. Let's say on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, you have an 8 a.m. class, and so you have to get up early. And let's say you get up, whatever before that and get to class. On Tuesday, Thursday, let's say you don't have a class till 11. You might be tempted to say, well, I can sleep until 10 and still make it to my class. And though that, might be true, what you're doing is you're setting yourself up for a really wonky sleep schedule. Because let's say Monday night, you say, okay, well, I can stay up a little later tonight because I'm not getting up so early tomorrow. No big deal. But then Tuesday night, you get up later and then you stay up later. Now you got to get up early Wednesday. Now your body's on tilt and you're not working in the same way. Some nights you're going to be deprived of sleep. It's so much better to go to bed roughly the same time and wake up roughly the same time. So if you have an 8 a.m. class and you're going to get up at 6 or 7, do that every day. And then on Tuesday, Thursday, you'll get a big chunk of time in the morning to take advantage of that deliberate practice resource you have. Go hit the practice room. Do the most important stuff first. It's also good to be mindful of your pattern of sleep cycles. When you get a chance to go on break, winter break, summer break, what have you, and you can just sleep and not have to set an alarm, take inventory. How long do you tend to sleep for? Do you sleep for 7.5 hours? Do you sleep for 8 hours? Do you sleep for 10 hours? You may find patterns to the amount of time you sleep, and it may be that that's, pretty much lines up with how long it takes for your body to kind of go through those different cycles and come back out. So if you can figure that out, I personally feel that I'm better at 6 hours of sleep or 7.5 hours of sleep. 8 hours of sleep, and I feel pretty groggy. So maybe I have 1.5 hour sleep cycle patterns of some kind. I don't know. I don't have a citation for that, but just be mindful of what your body wants to do when it doesn't matter as much. A couple of things you can do physically to kind of help yourself get there as well. So most human beings have 12 pairs of ribs. The bottom 2 pairs of ribs are not connected to the rib cage in the same way, and they're called floating ribs. It seems to be a bit of a physiological off switch for us to have activation in that region of our body when we inhale. Now, for some of us who play wind instruments, we may already know that our lungs kind of go over this whole middle region of our body. The upper part of our lungs have a greater exchange ratio of oxygen. So when we do upper chest expansion, when we breathe, we're actually getting a greater volume of oxygen in terms of the volume of air. And so that's made to work in a certain way with our body. If we can instead focus our energies on taking a nice relaxed breath and getting the lower back to just slowly kind of expand out and get that floating rib area to expand and contract, and focus the breath to be in that region. It's kind of like an off switch for maybe some of the stressors or neurochemicals, adrenaline glands, things like that. If our minds are racing, it's a way that we can kind of calm some of the systems down. And so just a couple of slow, relaxed breaths. Put your hands on your lower back and just breathe slowly. And try to feel that expansion in your lower back. I even feel calmer now just doing that. But if you do that a couple times right before you go to bed, instead of being on that smartphone or that device, you'll find that it helps you fall asleep more effectively. There's a couple of, you can look up this information as well. Feel free to Google any of this stuff, but there's something called alternate nostril breathing, and there's a couple different ways you may find it. But the concept is that we tend to take in more of our air nasally through one side, and that is connected to activation on one side of our brain. One of the things that makes it tough to fall asleep is if our brain has a lot of chatter going on, and sometimes that might actually be kind of both hemispheres of the brain have more activation. Some people believe that if you breathe through one nostril, you can disrupt whatever pattern is going on right now. So if your brain is racing, you can just breathe in through one side of the nostril, breathe out through the other. And I wrote it here. So in left, out right, repeat, 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 or in right, out left, out right, repeat, or in left, out left. Those are the common ones that I saw. So if you try these patterns of breathing, let's go ahead and we'll do it together now. I'm going to do in left, out right. So I'm going to plug my right side, so I'll breathe in through the left. And so you just do that for a couple of breaths, maybe a minute, something like that. And what you may find is it kind of helps calm the body down. And so you have an easier time of falling asleep and you get more restful sleep. Another thing you can do is there's something called brain waves. I'm not going to get too in depth into the neuroscience behind it, but there's basically brain waves, in our brain, obviously, that function at different frequencies. Gamma waves are the fastest, and those tend to be they're associated with us being the most alert and conscious. And they kind of go down from there. And as you get to the slower and slower waves, and there's something called delta waves, and delta waves are super slow. Those are the ones that are, detached awareness, more of the healing and deep sleep. And that's what's kind of, the activation is seen to be more delta wave heavy. You can do a Google search for delta waves, sleep, delta waves promote sleep, that kind of thing. And you can find all sorts of videos where people have put together music that is kind of laced with delta waves. And this picture up here is from a video, has like 47 million views, just to give you an example of how many people, find that this to be, quite helpful. So I'm just going to play a tiny little excerpt of this one here. So for those of you that have studied physics of music, you probably understand that if there are two frequencies and they are, essentially 1 hertz away from each other, they will create a resultant tone of 1 hertz. And so music that is laced with delta waves has slightly dissonant sounds all happening at the same time, so that the resultant tones are in these, kind of delta wave speeds. And if you listen to delta waves, you can kind of essentially entrain your brain to kind of sync up with that to some extent. I'm glossing over a lot of the details here, but it can kind of help relax the brain down into more of a state of sleep. You're not going to pass out, but it definitely calms things down so you can get more restful sleep. That particular video is like 8 hours long, so you literally could sleep with that playing the whole time. I've never done that, but sometimes I'll listen to just a couple minutes, maybe do some of the nostril breathing, find my lower ribs, maybe do a little stretching. And if I have kind of a routine of 5 or 10 or 15 minutes that is along those lines, as opposed to like Facebook, Instagram, eat a candy bar, and then try to go to sleep, very different results in terms of the sleep productivity. So those are just some things to keep in mind. I just wanted to give a shout out to M&W Custom Trombones. They have helped me find my voice and have kind of matched me with we worked together and came up with a really great instrument. I just absolutely love playing it. For those of you that play the trombone, and if you're interested in a high-level custom model, check them out when we actually get to go back to conferences and seminars. If you can get your hands on an M&W, I highly recommend trying that out. For those of you that are not familiar with my work, I have a website, I have a YouTube channel, I post a lot of videos, and I try to put up a lot of resources, particularly for musicians, although some of it can apply a little bit more broadly. Just go to jasonsulliman.com and just start fishing around. There's all sorts of stuff up there. And again, you can contact me through my website if you have any questions or thoughts. Feel free to do so. I hope that you have an amazing semester or an amazing year. This is a tough time, but hang in there. We're going to get through this and it's going to be great. Let's be productive with our time. Let's accomplish our goals and dreams. We can do this.